Commission. I'd like to welcome everyone here to our event. And we're here tonight to speak about a new report from AEI, the Institute for Family Studies, and the Wheatley Institution on the divided state of our unions on family formation in post-COVID America. I'd like to thank Peyton Roth, Paul Edwards, Elise El-Haj, and Michael Toscano for helping to make this report and this event happen tonight. I'm grateful to all of them and to many more people who have been a part of this process. So tonight I'm going to turn over the podium pretty quickly to my colleagues who are co-authors on this report. First, it's going to be Jason Carroll, who is the Associate Director of the Wheatley Institution and a professor in the School of Family Life at BYU. And then following him will be Lyman Stone, who is a research fellow at the Institute for Family Studies and also an adjunct fellow here at AEI. And then my colleague Wendy Wang, who's the Director of Research at the Institute for Family Studies and a former senior researcher at the Pew Research Center. So we're going to be kind of all together, kind of sharing the key results from this new report. And again, I'm turning over the podium now to Jason Carroll to get us started here.
Welcome. Thank you for spending a little bit of time with us today. As all of us know who are in the data business, the thing that we've learned very quickly in the context of the pandemic is how inadequate some of our data sources have become very quickly, right? New data has become old data, and many of the data sources that we often turn to don't have the questions we need to investigate what's happening and what's occurring. For our team at the Wheatley Institution and together with our friends and associates at IFS, last year we scrambled to do a series of studies looking primarily at the pandemic's influence on teen mental health issues. And today we're excited to gather together and talk about a new report where in this one we've looked at the specific question of where is family formation in the United States headed? In order to get a context, and I'll set the stage for us a bit, and then I'll turn time over to Wendy and Lyman in particular to go through some of the analyses. But by way of reminder and by way of setting the context, as we came into the pandemic setting, many of us in family research and family demography were already noting that we were at significant declines in marriage and fertility rates. And in fact, by 2020, at the outset of the pandemic, we saw this reaching all-time historic lows. Now, these trends would be noteworthy in and of themselves, but of particular interest has been the way that family formation trends are not declining uniformly in our society. In fact, they vary quite a bit by various different subgroups. And again, those trends would be of note in and of themselves, but they've become of particular interest in the fact that these non-uniform trends are actually being identified as having significant consequences. In fact, Bloom and Eng in their 2020 article in Demography highlighted that family formation processes are becoming increasingly central in producing and reproducing economic inequalities in our society today. So with that, we found this to be a good area of investigation. What is happening because of the pandemic, and what do we expect to see as the trends as we emerge from the pandemic to be? In particular, we investigated in this report three scenarios, three possibilities, if you will. We draw some of our language from this, or our way of framing this, from some remarks and a lecture given by Ross Dothot at the National Marriage Project, a lecture that he did there a little while ago, where Ross highlighted this idea of three possible scenarios that we might see and where they might come. The first he called the decadence deepen scenario. He says one future is what you might call the decadence deepen scenario. In this future, we will look back and recognize that the pandemic took trends inimical to family life and turbocharged them, with the possible consequence that milestones delayed will become milestones foregone. An extra dose of postponement for a generation that was already postponing marriage and childbearing to the edge of its reproductive years could have ripple effects long after the pandemic is finished. Ross also speculated that perhaps maybe what we'll see is another scenario that we might call the wake up or the renaissance scenario. He described it this way. He says, call it the wake-up call or the Renaissance scenario, where everything I've just described, everything grim that's happened to young people and parents and families during the pandemic becomes a reason to rebel against pre-pandemic trends and forge a different way of life. In this scenario, the heightened experience of isolation could encourage a stronger sense of urgency among young people when they return to life in full. Finally, Ross suggested that there may be actually a third scenario or a third possibility. He says, now let us consider a third scenario, which he calls a scenario of family polarization. He says, this is the scenario of family polarization where decadence deepens for some and the wake-up call happens for others, and the division tracks already existing divides in American culture, divides in ideology and religion, geography, and social class. So we set up our analyses in order to investigate this and look at which of these scenarios does seem to be most likely emerging from the pandemic when it comes to family formation. As a little bit of an overall capture, and see the ways that we've set things up in the report, overall, we found no consistent evidence for a general trend of decadence or a general trend of Renaissance either. Overall interest in marriage upticked a little bit overall among Americans, but the share of Americans reporting that their interest in childbearing moved a bit downwards. Ultimately, what we see from our results is a pattern that fits perhaps this third scenario, evidence for family polarization. So I'm going to turn the time over to Wendy. She's going to move through some of the sub-analyses that were needed to really start to get a better sense of the picture of what's occurring with those types of different sub-analyses.
Thank you, Jason. Oops. Good evening. Thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to be in an in-person event. This is the first since last year. So I'm going to give a very brief introduction about the data that we use for this report, and then also present some key findings from the survey. So we have two sources for the data. On the first one is the two survey that we did with Wheatley. One was in May to June of 2021. That one was the one with a broader range of questions related to family. And the other one, we just did it in last month, and we asked a few questions about, whether people's desire for marriage and children have changed since COVID. And so both of these surveys have a sample of 2,500 people, and the ages are 18 to 55. And we also use the general social survey for this report, and that is a long-lasting survey since 1972. And Lyman is going to cover the results from that survey. Okay, so we asked a very basic question for the unmarried Americans. Do you want to get married someday? And as you know that, our marriage rate is at an all-time low right now. Barely half of the Americans are married now. So it's no surprising that you see about 48% of the people who say that they actually want to get married. And then another 30% say they are not sure. But still, it's a very minority of the people. 22% of people say they don't want to get married. So there are people whose desire are stronger than others. And we found the pattern that is really, we find the differences by income, religion, and party ID. So people with higher family income, which, in our report, which is that their family income is over $100,000 or more, they are more likely to say they want to get married. 60% of them say so. But for the people who have an income of less than $50,000, it's only less than half of the percentage of them say they want to get married. Also people who attend church or religious services more frequently are more likely to say they would like to get married one day than those than people who rarely or never attend church or religious service. And when it comes to party ID, Republicans are more likely than Democrats and independents to say they would like to get married. Similarly, we find that college-educated and Hispanics and Asians also have a stronger desire for marriage. And also men have a stronger desire for marriage than women. So similarly, we also ask question for the people who don't have children currently, whether they would like to have children one day. And so overall, about slightly more than half of the people say they actually want to have children one day. Again, people with higher income are much more likely. Actually, the difference is not as big as the difference in the desire for marriage, but still we see a difference in terms of by income, in terms of the desire for having children. About 56% of the people with higher income say they want to have children. 51% say they do. But this is interesting because traditionally, people with lower income actually have more children than people with less income. So now we actually see, at least in terms of desire, their desire actually is weaker than the people with higher income. Also, people, again, the religious folks who attend church more frequently, much more likely to say they would like to have children. In this case, people who go to church a few times a year also have stronger desire for children. Again, Republicans have a much stronger desire for having children compared to Democrats and independents. Interestingly, Hispanics and Asians also, compared to other races, have a stronger desire for having kids. So now we have established the baseline. So this is our most recent survey just last month. We asked people whether their desire for marriage have changed since COVID-19 started last year. So as you saw what Jason said, overall we see a uptick for marriage, slightly uptick for marriage, but it's not the same for everyone. Again, we see that the people with higher income are much more likely to say that their desire for marriage has increased since COVID. And then 18% of them said their desire has increased, and 9% of them say that desire has decreased. So there is a 9 percentage point net increase in their desire for marriage since COVID-19. For people who go to church more frequently, this their increase is 8 percentage points. And again, for Republicans, it's 5 percentage points. But interestingly, you see, there's actually a pretty big decline in interest in marriage among independents. It's a negative 4 percentage point for their interest in marriage, which is quite interesting. And also, we found among the marriage seems to become more appealing for Blacks and Hispanics since COVID. That's something that it's interesting to see. So lastly, we asked a question about whether people's desire for having children have changed since COVID. Again, the similar pattern has occurred, and we say that for the higher income, that like Jason had mentioned, overall the desire for fertility has declined since COVID, and people are less likely to want to have children. But this is not true for everyone. Because if you look at the income and the higher income, this doesn't happen among people with higher income, and also doesn't happen among Republicans and the people who go to church more frequently. It does happen among the people with lower income. We see a net decrease of 11 percentage point drop for their desire for having children. And this is a pretty sharp decline. And also among the people who are rarely or never go to church, and as well as Democrats. And also, among Hispanics, we see a negative 12%, basically a decrease of 12 percentage points in their desire for marriage. So, this is just setting. This is basically what we're saying, that it's, even though overall we see a decline in the desire for having children, but it's only for these groups that we see much significant decline. With that, I'm going to turn to Lyman for some historical trends.
Got to move this back up. Very different heights here. So we've got all these numbers on our survey that we did in May and September, that we ask how COVID is impacting people's family preferences, family formation, all these fun questions, or in some cases, not so fun when they give bad news. But there's always this question of, where does this actually fit in? I mean, is this different from what we would normally see? In fact, one of the big problems over the last year or two is that we're not the only people who said, oh, COVID's interesting, let's run a survey. And then a lot of those surveys will get different results, and you always wonder, how do they fit into the historic data? How does this look if we apply it to things we already knew before COVID? So what we want to look at is take a longer view here. We want to know if the aftermath of COVID will see conditions for family formation get better, get worse, or just get stranger than they were. It's not going to surprise you to know that I'm going to argue for the last, that in some sense it's just gotten strange. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at childlessness and never married status in the General Social Survey going back to 1972. By some of the covariates that we saw big changes on in our survey. So here I'm showing breaking out in 3 groups of religious attendance: those who attend very frequently, generally like more than monthly, those who attend very rarely or never, and then kind of your in-betweens. And we're showing the share that are never married on the left, and the share that are childless on the right. And this is of people aged 18 to 55. So what you can see is that over time, the share of the more secular Americans who are never married has risen. That's that blue line on the left. It's gone up. More and more of non-religious Americans have never been married. Whereas that red line is more religious Americans, and it's been about stable. Maybe it's been up a little bit, but it hasn't been up nearly as much. So we've seen rising polarization of marital status by religion. When we look at childlessness, it's less extreme, but we do see some increase in polarization. Again, less religious Americans are more likely to not have children. More religious Americans are more likely to have children. That gap has grown somewhat over the last 40 years or so. So what does our survey imply about this? What does it suggest these trends are going to do? So if we look at those kind of, do you think you're more likely to have a child or less likely to have a child, or more likely to get married or less likely, we can use those to kind of guess if those likeliness descriptions are true, which of course all surveys have error, people's representations of their intentions don't always match their behaviors, but if that's what happened, what would these lines look like? So here we see what they would look like by religiosity. We would see about stable never married status for the non-religious, and we would see a decline in never married status among the religious. That is, an increase in marriage, right? So that's more polarization of marriage across religiosity. we would find religious and less religious Americans becoming more unlike each other in terms of their family life, continuing a trend that we've seen for decades. We would also see a rising difference for childlessness. That is, we'd see an increase in childlessness among the less religious and about no change among the more devout. So that's how these graphs work. I'm going to go through this for all four of our kind of interesting covariates. I'm not going to explain the graphs in quite as meticulous of detail for all of the other ones, since you kind of understand what you're looking at. So here we have partisanship. So again, you can see rising polarization, Democrats coded in blue, Republicans in red. There's been growing differences by marital status, and there's been growing differences of parenthood status as well, though again, the difference in parenthood status has not changed as much. So what does our survey imply? Well, again, more polarization. For Democrats, you'd see a stable or slightly declining never married status. For Republicans, you'd see a big decline in non-marriedness. Because I've defined these things in negatives, the phrasing gets a little interesting. And likewise for partisanship, you'd see rising difference and intensifying polarization. If we look by education, we're getting into a very different kind of variable. And what I mean is, when we talk about religion and partisanship, we are talking about values, attitudes, worldviews, beliefs. Yes, they might be measured behaviorally, but we think these are proxies for life orientations. That is, they're the kinds of things that are deeply private and aren't included on government surveys, right? Which means when you want to get big, huge data sets of demographic stuff, you don't have access to this in most cases, right? Which means when we talk about polarization in the long run, often we're talking about things that are going to show up in the American Community Survey or the Current Population Survey or these surveys, which is going to be things like socioeconomic class and race. So by education, we see there's been a big change over time. At first, by marital status, we saw declining polarization. That is, college-educated and non-college educated Americans were becoming more like each other. But then now we're polarizing again. But that's because the polarization label is kind of silly here. What's really happening is there's been not much change in marital behaviors of people with a college degree, whereas people without a college degree are becoming less and less likely to get married, right? For childlessness, we've seen a decrease in polarization over time. Again, because the non-college educated are becoming more likely to have never had kids. So what does our survey suggest? By marriage, there could be increasing polarization by education. So we might see widening gaps, which we've been seeing for a while, but it could continue, widening gaps in marriage. Okay. By childlessness, it's the opposite. The increase or the decrease in desire for a child was bigger for less educated Americans, which means these two groups could actually be coming closer together in terms of their reproductive norms and behaviors. So this is a mixed bag. Marriage becoming more polarized, perhaps, childlessness less so. And when we get to race, of course we have 4 lines here, it's much more noisy, but we actually see decreasing polarization for both of these metrics. That is, that the racial and ethnic groups that were the most likely to say, COVID made me not want to get married, or COVID made me not want to have a child, they tended to be at the opposite extreme to begin with, such that if all these statements are true representations of actual behaviors these people intend to take, we would actually see marital and fertility behaviors become more similar across racial and ethnic groups. So, to summarize, we see more family formation among the religious and among Republicans, less among the non-religious Democrats and the non-college educated. And if you break it out for the college educated, it's kind of neutral. There's less polarization by racial and ethnic group, and possibly less by education, although the General Social Survey doesn't have good income statistics, so I couldn't test our very strong income findings. So there could be income polarization not tied to educational polarization. But we see more polarization by values and worldview, stuff we're measuring with partisanship or religion. So what we're seeing is not just more polarization or less polarization. We're actually changing the kinds of things we polarize around. Racial and ethnic categories are becoming less predictive, according to our survey, of these kinds of family outcomes. Whereas values differences that occur within racial and ethnic groups may become more important. Now, is this true just right now, or is it true in the long run? Is it that the crisis of COVID caused people to fall back on deep-seated worldviews and express them in a more dramatic way, and that's going to fade once the crisis fades? Or is this actually going to change how people act for years to come? And on that, we don't have a definitive answer yet. I'd love to say we did, but that will be the question for further research in the future. So now I will pass it off to Brad to finish us up.
Okay, so an obvious, I think, question for all of us here is, who cares that there is this kind of growing family polarization potentially emerging out of COVID time? Like, what's the big deal here? Well, what I'd like to suggest to you tonight is that in a world kind of turned upside down, it seems, at least every decade economically, in a world where there's rising political polarization, in a world where there's also, unfortunately, falling social trust, I think you could argue that in some important ways, the family is a safe harbor today like none other in the 21st century. Now, I say that kind of acknowledging that, the family requires, as all of us know, its share of struggle and sacrifice. For instance, my colleague here, Dan Cox, has recently noted in a survey that married mothers, quote, struggle with the feeling that don't have time for themselves, unquote. Okay, and I think we all can appreciate his finding on that score. Nevertheless, it's still the case that the direction and meaning, the stability and solidarity that are typically found in married families means that men, women, and children are significantly more likely to flourish today. Flourish economically, flourish socially, flourish emotionally, compared to Americans who are not part of married families. Okay, so again, the point here is that there are important ways in which the married family is a kind of safe harbor for Americans today. And we can see that in a variety of different empirical studies. I'm not going to go through a catalog here, obviously. We have a recent study that came out by, for instance, the economists Christos Makridis and Clara Piano, showing, as this slide indicates, that married individuals did better emotionally during COVID time. They were less depressed, they were less anxious, they were less worried, and they had less of a kind of a decline of interest in life more generally. So that's one piece of evidence from COVID time. And then kind of looking back, to before COVID time, there was a lot of discussion about deaths of despair. And scholars on the left and the right, like Philip Cohen on the left and Scott Winship on the right, in their own different ways kind of underline how marriage is linked to deaths of despair for particularly white working class Americans. So white working class Americans who were never married or who were divorced were much more likely to succumb to the deaths of despair that Ann Case and Angus Deaton alerted us to in sort of the time before COVID. Now, again, I could talk about many more studies. I'm not going to do that, but I just want to kind of underline these are some of the examples of kind of the research that would tell us that marriage and family life matter for Americans today. So in light of that, it's, I think, worth thinking about two groups who seem to be kind of increasingly distanced from family life as we kind of go forward today. And we can think first kind of along class lines about how poor working class Americans are less likely not just to marry, but also to have children. So, in some important ways, they may not have kind of the means to put a ring on it or the means to go ahead and have kids. And this will, of course, have important consequences for them as they move into midlife and especially later life in terms of getting social, emotional, health support and, of course, financial support as well. So that's sort of the first group that we're kind of thinking about here. And there's a kind of economic story, I think, that we can appreciate with this first group. But the second story here is not economic, it's cultural. And that is to sort of suggest that I think kind of going forward, especially that sort of people on the sort of more secular and more progressive end of the spectrum are going to be less likely to marry and have kids. I mean, they already are less likely today to marry and have kids. And so that's because they're more likely to kind of embrace an individualistic way of life, and they're less likely to kind of accord value to marriage, for instance. And then I think particularly when we look at sort of what's happened with COVID, they were also more likely to embrace what Jonathan Haidt has called kind of a safetyist mindset, where they're kind of concerned with avoiding risk. And that served them well in some ways with COVID in terms of risks for getting COVID and dying of COVID. There's obviously debate about that, but I think you can make the case. But it's also the case on other areas in terms of family formation that this kind of safetyist mindset is going to make them more reluctant to marry, and especially to have kids. So that's a kind of consequence of being more risk averse, I think, in today's moment. By contrast, kind of from our perspective in the report, family formation remains comparatively higher for three different kinds of groups. The first group is the rich, who have both, kind of the means to, get married and have kids, less worried about affording all the things that kind of attend family life today. But also it's worth noting, have the men to form families. So when you kind of look at trends, as I did with my colleague Wendy Wang in our own data, we find that, full-time employment is highest. I mean, not surprising, but it's highest among men in that upper third of our economic ladder here in America. So again, they have both the means and the men to go ahead with with marriage and childbearing in today's world. And then we can think too, on the cultural side, how religious Americans are more likely to have, both the motivation today to get married. They tend to kind of endow marriage and family life with a degree of sacrality that shapes their orientation to family life. Also to have kind of the community support, the encouragement, the counsel, the help when it comes to navigating marital troubles, when it comes to raising kids. And then finally, they're doing better emotionally at this moment in time. There was a recent Gallup poll done, last year showing that kind of the one group that was not experiencing a big dip in their emotional well-being during COVID time was the group, Americans who are regularly attending religious services. So for these three reasons, I think, as they kind of emerge from COVID, they're more positive about getting married and more inclined to have kids. And then kind of a similar point about Republicans. Republicans, despite the behavior of some of their leaders, tend to be more likely to get married, to stay married, and to report that they're happily married, and also we're seeing to have more kids as well. So this kind of like family mindset is with them, and I think has sort of helped to shape how they're thinking about things even today. They've also kind of been more COVID cavalier. One term you hear kind of in the internet these days is sort of anti-fragile. And there's obviously a downside to that when it comes to COVID in some ways, but when it comes to kind of family formation, I think that kind of anti-fragility translates into a greater willingness to both marry and especially to have kids, in these times. So that would, I think, help us to sort of think about how Republicans are doing as we go forward today. Now, as scholars who are concerned both about the family and also about kind of trying to depolarize American life, the divide that we're chronicling tonight is not one that we welcome. And so as I think about kind of things that we could do to minimize this divide kind of going forward, make kind of just two big points. The first point is sort of from my friends on the right. And the point is this, that I think conservatives and Republicans have not been overly kind of open to or willing to think about embracing family policy. But I think that they should be pivoting now to give more Americans the means that they need to start families, to go ahead and get married and have kids. And that means doing things like eliminating the marriage penalty. It means doing things like making the child tax credit permanent. And it means doing things like passing paid family leave. These are the kinds of measures that would make it easier, I think, for many working class and middle class Americans from a kind of a practical or financial perspective to go ahead and get married. The second point I'd make here, and this is for my friends on the left, I think, is that progressives, liberals still dominate the commanding heights of our culture. And I would encourage them to stop discounting the importance of marriage and families to people's well-being. There's too much mainstream messaging from movies like Marriage Story to articles like the Washington Post, quote, "Parenthood seems to make us unhappy. So why do we keep doing it?" These, kinds of offerings give the public the false impression that marriage usually ends in divorce and that family life is misery-inducing. But the truth is that today, most marriages go the distance, and men and women living in families are doing better than their peers flying solo without children. There's striking work done by Chris Herbst, for instance, at ASU, showing that it used to be the case that parents were less happy than their childless fellow citizens, but today that's switched. So for whatever reason, it is the case today that not only married folks, but parents in general are doing better when it comes to happiness than their childless peers. So progressives, I think, need to just appreciate this truth and to tell it both for their side, so to speak, but also because our culture, I think, depends upon progressives telling a better story about marriage and family life. Because for better or for worse, progressives, liberals tend to dominate our public conversations related to family matters. So, if we don't take policy measures like the ones that I've just sketched out, if we don't kind of see a kind of cultural shift in our conversations and our offerings around family, I think we can expect to see that this family divide that we've talked about tonight will continue to deepen. I think this would be an alternative that none of us here tonight would like. This would be an America where strong and stable families are the preserve of the rich, the religious, and Republicans to an increasing degree, and where everyone else is much less likely to enjoy the shelter, the security, and the solidarity of what in some ways is today's ultimate harbor, and that is the family. So with that, we're done with our presentation. Thank you for joining us for this first panel. We're going to shift in a few minutes to a second panel of respondents who are both scholars and journalists. So before I do that, let me just take two questions from anyone here in the room. Any questions from people here who are in the room about this report on the divided state of our unions? Yeah, Brian.
Are the variables of party or partisanship and religiosity independent enough to be meaningfully different? In other words, if I looked at the crosstabs and saw atheist Democrats and atheist Republicans, would the atheist Republicans be more likely to want to have kids?
Right. So the question is kind of, are the variables related to partisanship and religion kind of meaningfully different one from another? And would we see kind of effects for each of these two different categories in the other group? And at least in a multivariate context, we do look at how, variables related to income, partisanship, religiosity, as well as race, ethnicity, and a variety of gender and age are linked to the desire to both get married and the desire to have kids. And we do see that both, particularly religion and partisanship, across both of those two outcomes have an independent effect. So it suggests that, religious Democrats would be relatively more likely to be married and have kids. And that say, secular Republicans would be relatively more likely to be married and have kids compared to secular Democrats, to answer your question. So, yeah. One more question. Yeah, Bill.
Could you say a little more about something that Lyman talked about some, which is the relationship of the short-term changes in desire and these long-term trends? In other words, was the change in this short period of time so significant that we should read a lot into it in terms of trying to project the future? And how much of it was due to COVID, do you think, and how much to just the continuation of earlier trends?
Right, so the question is about whether or not this is just going to kind of be an extension of the underlying trend that, we're going to see, and we have seen in the general social survey, or if this is, going to be kind of a situation where this polarization is augmented. And at least judging from our September survey, we're predicting, some degree of augmentation, and the arrows that Lyman included in his slides kind of give you a sense of how these gaps increase. Now, it's certainly the case that only time will tell if that, in fact, is an accurate projection. And it could be that, that we kind of return to a kind of measure of real normalcy from COVID in the next year. But if, some of these underlying dynamics in terms of things like kind of, safetyism or anti-fragility kind of become sort of attached to people based upon their religiosity or their secularity or their partisanship, if people's sort of interest in marriage and family life becomes even more ideological than it currently is, we would expect to see more polarization. And we have seen with the Deseret News BYU American Family Survey that Republicans have kind of maintained, at least kind of at the normative level, their support for kind of marriage and the importance of the kind of like the two-parent family at a much, kind of more consistent, rate or pattern across that survey since 2015, whereas kind of support at sort of at the normative level for, marriage and say like two-parent family has fallen, more markedly for liberals and Democrats. So again, it remains to be seen kind of if this polarization will be, increasing at some kind of accelerated rate in the next few years. But we do at least right now have some cause for concern in that regard. Okay, so we're going to turn over the podium to Dr. Paul Edwards from the Wheatley Institution, who's going to be kind of managing our panel of scholars and journalists who are kind of helping us to think about the implications of this new report. So thank you.
Yes. Well, welcome. We're really grateful to be here. My name is Paul Edwards. I am the director of the Wheatley Institution at Brigham Young University, and really grateful that we've been able to participate in this study with the Institute for Family Studies, and grateful that we can share some of the findings here at the American Enterprise Institute today. And we have just an extraordinary panel here to help us think through some of the implications from this. I do want to just note as we get underway here, we do have an online audience. And if you have questions, feel free to submit them to peyton.roth, that's spelled Peyton, .roth@aei.org. And we'll try to get to those questions at some point here. So let me take a moment to introduce our panel today. Again, just a really extraordinary group that we have here. So Saagar Enjeti, who is the now known for his independent podcast, Breaking Points with Crystal and Saagar, distinguished journalist, has covered The Hill, the White House, and has a very interesting new podcast that I'd encourage all of you to spend time listening to. Very current and engaging I think geared largely to a millennial audience, but anyone can listen, right?
Anyone can. If you can take boomer jokes.
So we will encourage you to participate that way. And then to his right, Emily Jashinsky is the culture editor at The Federalist, and you'll see Emily frequently on a number of television shows, Fox News, Fox Business. She comes from Wisconsin, is my understanding,
That's right.
and bachelor's degree at George Washington University, and is also director of the National Journalism Center, which I think is based here in DC.
Yep, absolutely.
And then we have Isabel Sawhill. I don't know how to introduce Belle. Truly one of the great minds in thinking about the American family and its structure and concerns about poverty alleviation. Just one of the great deans of social thought in American life today, and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. And too long of a history here to go through, but we'll gather your thoughts here in just a moment. And then Ramesh Ponnuru, a senior fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute, and of course, the senior editor for National Review, one of the great leaders in conservative thought today. So let's get into the report here. I'm actually going to start with the two of you right here, and wanted to note that, so Saagar, you've written about the right's embrace of cultural opposition populism. And Emily, you've been very clever, I think, in pointing out the cultural divide that we see between elites and the public, like the ratio of scores on Rotten Tomatoes between how critics will view a particular film versus an audience, right? We'll see inverse relationships sometime. So where does the concept of familialism that this report talks about fit in to that elite populist divide in America today?
Well, so it's hugely important, and I remember actually when I was an intern at AEI, it was when Coming Apart came out, and that was really the book that, for me, put words and research to a phenomenon that I sort of fuzzily identified as a kid in Wisconsin, and that book is still, that's the book that I assigned to my journalism students. I think it's the best book about journalism, and the best book about how having that lens is so influential. If that lens is shared by the people who are disproportionately making our policy, disproportionately running our media, disproportionately governing the conversations in our C-suites, that is going to have a huge impact that alienates, and I use that word intentionally, we're here at AEI, and Tim Carney has talked about what he calls, also very clever, the Lena Dunham fallacy, which is the tendency for us to attribute to decadent elites, as Tim says, a phenomenon that's actually increasing among the working class. And so this study, I think, is very, very important because it's getting at something that's going to get worse. It's already very bad, but it's going to continue to get worse, and that's not just bad media coverage, and there are a lot of interesting ways the media is very, very bad at covering marriage and family, particularly because it often comes from people who in the past maybe hadn't experienced that, but as Tim says, actually kind of do more than working class people. There's a million ways that they cover it poorly. I think one thing we don't even realize necessarily is how they love to, as Brad got to, talk about, they like to talk down these institutions and undercut these institutions, even while they live them out in their own lives. And so it's an important thing, but they sort of have taken these institutions out of vogue. And that has a real effect on the people who consume their policies, or who are affected by their policies, consume their news, consume their objects of popular culture. And so if these trends keep up, it really speaks to the coming apart phenomenon getting much, much worse. And on cultural social issues. It's just like on economic issues. And that's as important. And the left wants to talk about the economic issues. It wants to talk about rising income and wealth inequality. What it doesn't want to talk about is that also is correlated with rising inequality and social capital.
Saagar?
Yeah, I think that's incredibly well said, Emily. And I think the most important things that jumped out to me at the report were when I saw that the most precipitous increases amongst children, wanting children, was amongst higher income, and the most precipitous decline was amongst lower income. So what does that tell you? It's a class story. And whenever we have these different class stories, the media really just doesn't know how to tell this whatsoever. To the extent that they do, it is told in a way such that working class people can self-actualize by like making money on OnlyFans, as opposed to, you know, all of the data that we just went through about, you know, actually you're going to be a lot happier if you were to get married and to have children. I'm not saying that you know should do that or force you to do that, but the data is pretty clear.
That's actually very real, by the way. ABC News did an entire 2020 investigation that you can watch on Hulu that is basically lauding OnlyFans for lifting people in the working class and giving them work to do. I guarantee you none of them would want their daughters on OnlyFans.
No, of course. And I mean, this is a classic coming apart phenomenon about people who, you know, preach the ability to be able to get divorced or never actually get divorced themselves. It pretty much holds across almost all social and drug phenomenons. These are all okay for these, you know, for these working class folks who just don't know any better. And it's incredibly patronizing in the way that it's talked down to and the way that it's pushed through policy. So from this report, and I'm going to do everything I can in order to draw attention to it, because that phenomenon itself, it tells the entire story of the country. I was talking with Brad before the event recently about, I mean, for me personally, like I have a show that's about politics, but I like to talk about what I call small p politics, which is what it means to be a human in a society. And right now, you can see that single male wages down relative to where they were in 1990, which has all sorts of horrific downstream effects. Fertility rates, income, whether you're going to go to college, whether you're happy, whether you're going to get married, whether you can even find a partner, let alone marriage, whether you can find somebody to live with. And are you going to see any real coverage of this as an actual phenomenon? No, because doing so would validate the idea that, you know, maybe men are being shortchanged in our society right now. So all of the different cultural blind spots that Emily's discussing have all these terrible downstream effects that ripple through culture and are coming down and really I think infecting is the only way to really say it, the way that both the future elites of America are even able to talk about these problems, but also how normal, regular folks consuming Hollywood who watch Marriage Story or might see that Washington Post article, might see the Hulu thing about OnlyFans, are being acculturated to accept something that makes them miserable and much worse off in the long run.
Okay. I'm going to have to figure out how to explain OnlyFans to our BYU audience. And without having them go and look for themselves. So,
good luck.
Belle, I'm actually going to throw the question you asked back your direction. I'm very interested to hear your thoughts about this, because you've written for a long time about the marriage haves and have-nots. And so is this an acceleration of the trend that we've seen? Does it feel permanent to you? I mean, do you have some sense about this? Is the data saying anything to you about what this reflects? Or is this just a continuation of a trend that we've already seen?
Well, I think, as was said before, that's a hard question to answer. And the little bit of data we have for COVID doesn't, you know, dictate a long-term trend, but I'm not going to disagree either with the what Lyman and others have said about that. We just don't know. I think there may be greater polarization for some of these cultural reasons that have already been talked about, as well as for economic reasons. If you have more economic inequality and you have wages being flat or stagnant or even declining at the bottom, that has ramifications for family life. I make a distinction between marriage and having children. Mm-hmm. I mean, we all like to think about them going together. I even like to think about them going together. But
And one before the other.
yes, and one before the other. But you know, some of us have written and talked a lot about the so-called success sequence, which is, you know, get an education first, then get a job and work full time, and then get married and don't have children until after you're in a committed, stable relationship. And in my 2018 book, The Forgotten Americans, by the way, I talked a lot about those three values. And I had what would be most people would call a left of center economic agenda in that book. But I said we've got to put that agenda in the context of values that virtually all Americans endorse, which is they endorse the value of education, they endorse the value of work, and they endorse the value of family. And to the extent that elites on the left are talking negatively about those values, that's not good. Now, having said that, I would say that it's pretty clear to me that marriage makes people better off. It makes them happier. It gives them more potential income because they can have two earners. They have more time to devote to everything, including to raising of children. And you know, all of the research that I've ever seen and written about suggests that marriage is the best context in which to raise children. Doesn't mean that single parents aren't struggling and don't need some help, but it's not ideal. That said, the Pew Research has said, and I quote on this because I think it's so interesting in the context of this report, our data showed that there's a much stronger link between marriage and happiness than there is between parenthood and happiness. So I think having children is a very brave thing to do. So maybe now I'm engaging in safetyism or whatever. But I'll tell you, my hat is off to anybody who has children, and especially who has a lot of children. There are so many challenges there, and the data, to me, are pretty clear that whatever, you know, meaning and religious significance and so forth people may attach to having children, it's not something that increases your well-being on a day-to-day basis.
Now,
and I think people who have not had children tend to romanticize it. And so I want to be clear about that. And I bring this up because, you know, there's been a tendency, I think, on the part of many, and, you know, people may disagree with me here, to look at both of these trends as negative. In other words, that people aren't marrying, and also that they aren't having as many children, that fertility is dropping. And no question, it has dropped, and probably will continue to drop. I think that is a long-term trend with maybe some bumps along the way. But I'm not sure that's a bad thing. You know, when I look at the world and I say there's 8 billion people in the world, and there are only 320 million here in the US. And so if we're, you know, not having a lot of children, if American women are not having a lot of kids, I'm not going to get too upset about it. There's plenty of people in the world, and we do have to be open then to immigration.
Okay.
So I'll stop at that because that was longer than you probably wanted.
I do want to, since you're the expert on the numbers on this, I do want, on those happiness studies around parenting, my understanding is that the big dip is when you have teenagers in the home. But that, is that true? I think that's what I've seen. So it gets a lot better once they're out of the home.
It gets you want to have children if you could just kind of rush through those first 18 years.
Yeah. Particularly
put it on
12
fast
to 18.
forward and then enjoy them after that. I wish at my age now I had more.
Now, Ramesh, I'm going to put you in an awkward position here by giving you sort of a hypothetical that I don't know fits you exactly, but say you're advising Democrats.
How many bullets do I have in this hypothetical?
None.
Okay.
Let's say you're advising Democratic candidates in the 2022 midterm elections. How does this study affect your counsel to Democratic candidates?
Well, I'm not sure that it does, frankly. First of all, am I giving them sincere advice?
Yes.
Okay.
Sincere advice.
So I think that there are quite a few long-term trends in our politics that are related to the demographic shifts that are covered in this report. But the short-term shifts are not always in the same direction. So, for example, from the time it started to be measured in the early 1980s, we have had a large marriage gap in our politics that is in fact larger than the gender gap. That is the difference between married men and women on the one hand and single men and women on the other in their voting preferences is much bigger than the difference between men in general and women in general. And that increased every 4 years like clockwork until 2016 when, and one can speculate about the reasons, it dropped a little bit. And then it dropped a little bit again in 2020. Now, it's still the case that the marriage gap is larger than the gender gap. But between 2016 and 2020 in particular, married men moved quite a bit from the Republicans to the Democrats, dropped in their support, in particular for Donald Trump. I would think that even if in the long run there are some trends in favor of this marriage gap, you might, as somebody who wants to win in 2022, try to nurture this short-term trend of married men toward the Democratic Party, just because when something like that happens, that it's surprising, that's interesting, that's also going your way, you want to build on it in the exact same way that Republicans are so excited about the apparent shift of a lot of Hispanics toward them in the last couple of years.
So what do you attribute that, say just a bit more about why we see that shift, do you think, on those margins?
Well, I think that Mitt Romney was a kind of natural candidate of a successful married person's party in a way that Donald Trump wasn't. Romney was more of a figure for religious piety than, let's say, his successor as the head of the Republican Party has been. And so I think in his personal life, Trump distanced the party from the religious right, and in his economic platform, he distanced himself from a certain kind of free market libertarianism. And to the extent that married people are both more socially traditional and more economically stable, it had the effect of softening that distinction.
Okay, interesting. Let me pick up a little bit on where Belle left off, because she broke out the marriage, inclination towards marriage, and the inclination towards childbearing in a way. But let's assume that all these trends we see as a decay of familialism in some way. How concerning is the trend to you? I was interested in your response there, where you thought the trend away from marriage is more concerning than the trend away from childbearing. I'd be interested in other panelists' views about these trends.
The trend around marriage and childbearing?
Pick up on where Belle left off.
Is the decline in fertility a bad thing?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I would think absolutely. I think at a civilization in its most basic level, its job is to replace itself. If you believe in science, that's actually baked into your DNA. But also, and look, I'm a child of immigrants, I'm not against immigration, but whenever we talk about civilization and societal cohesion, it's actually pretty dramatically important that people feel as if they're invested in the future. And whenever you have somebody, blood relativism, and this is something you can actually see in a lot of more tribal societies, is something that can make people feel that way, not always to the best. And I think the heroism of the United States has been able to mesh those two phenomenon, and that we've probably balanced a bit too far in the other direction and have deprioritized something which was baked into our ability to both assimilate future immigrants, but also to make people feel as if they're okay with future immigration. So I would actually point to people who, advance this as it's actually a shot in you're basically shooting yourself in the foot from both directions. You're assuring a sort of backlash both in the future, and you're also, basically contributing to a lot of societal cohesion. But beyond that, it's not even just about happiness with children. I would also look at some of the satisfaction numbers. I would also point to the fact that whenever we have people, and we see this consistently amongst those who are, whenever we see an income data and more, is that it's not always necessarily correlated between marriage and children. You can even see whenever wages rise. There's a famous study where, I think it was in North Dakota or somewhere, where you saw when wages were rising for single males, that even though the marriage rate didn't increase, that a lot of them started having children. So there does seem to be a natural inclination within the marriage and the dating market itself, which also leads to higher satisfaction that I think is really important. So it's a very long answer of just saying, I think so.
I'll split the difference a little bit and say that the decline of fertility is not entirely something that we should worry about, but also is in part. So to the extent you have a decline in number of children born because you've also had a decline in infant mortality, or a shift from an agrarian economy, or the development of a financial economy in which there are other alternatives to provide for your future than just producing more strong backs. All of those things are good, and in any case, they're inevitable. And so that's not what I would say should we shouldn't be trying to go to a pre-industrial birth rate, for example. But when we see that consistently and for quite long periods of time, people tell us that they want to have more children than they end up actually having. I think that we should stop and think, is there something about the way our society is structured that is not lending itself to this key ingredient of long-term happiness? And by happiness, by the way, I don't just mean, a psychic state. I mean like lasting and justified satisfaction with your life. And when we talk about those surveys, by the way, about happiness, I do wonder if anybody has done work on the correlation between grandparenthood and happiness. Because one thing I have gathered from my study of the science is that you can't have grandparenthood without having gone through parenthood first.
Yes, I'm discovering that.
Do we have that research?
Well, a sample of one here. Grandparenting is great. So, Emily, what are your thoughts on this?
Briefly, I was going to point to exactly what Ramesh just pointed to, and Lyman has done a lot of really detailed work on this, measuring how many children women say they want versus how many children women are actually having. And so that's the extent to which I think this is very concerning. The extent to which and also the measures of happiness are interesting in and of themselves, and we've sort of just talked about that in our responses to this question across the board. But measuring happiness at a snapshot in your parenthood versus sort of fulfillment is a very, very different thing. And so I do think it's true that our norms as to what should make you happy and what should make you fulfilled are going to distort maybe the responses we're seeing in the short term, if not the long term. So I think that's another thing to keep in mind, that what women are saying they want now may turn out to be different than what women, say millennial women, will want 10 years down the road when they are, so I'm an elder millennial. So women like me who are 38 and in the same position they were when they were 28. So I think we're going to see some of this shift. I think aging is a really important component of this. But I would again point to whether people are actually fulfilling their desires. And those desires, I think it's worth remembering, as Saagar pointed out, are really baked into our DNA.
So let me follow up. This is a question from online. Given what we've just said about that, are there policies that would make a difference? Do you suspect that we would see a increase in family formation with an increase in child tax credit, for example?
Well, I don't think that there's sort of one simple policy trick that will change all of these trends, but I do think that a properly designed child tax credit could help address some of the economic issues that keep people from starting families and maybe having as many children as they would like. I think that there are a lot of economic policies that we ought to look at in part with this in mind. So, for example, housing is an area where, particularly in frankly some of the bluest parts of our country, we have artificially reduced supply and thus opportunity and made it harder for people with young families to move to where the jobs are. So I think that higher education is another one. I think that's something where the way our higher education system is structured particularly affects upper middle class decisions on having kids in a way that is not necessarily ideal. So I think there are tons of things that we need to approach with this in mind. And partly what we need to do is just to have this idea that this is a social problem that needs to be on our agenda. The fact that people are not having as many kids as they want to have. And if we can address that problem, even on the margins, we make a huge difference on everything from the vitality of our economy to the affordability of Social Security.
Other thoughts on policy responses? Bill?
I think it's very hard to change these behaviors through public policy. There have been efforts to try to encourage marriage through public policy, marriage education programs, or more favorable tax treatment to married couples, child tax credits, etc. I don't think you can move the needle very much. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, because these families need support. And as Brad said earlier, if the left has not paid enough attention to culture, I think the right has not paid enough attention to the supports that families need. I do want to go back to something that keeps getting said here, because we may have a little bit of a different view of the data, and that is the idea that women are saying they want more children than they are actually having. And there is some data that shows that, but then there is other data that I find even more compelling that shows that we have a very high rate of unintended childbearing in the U.S. That's going down because of the availability of effective forms of contraception, which are helping people to align their actual behavior with their intentions. But, you know, there's no question in my mind that the data that shows that almost half, may be closer to 45% now, of all children born in the United States are, according to their mothers themselves, after they were born, the mother says, no, I didn't intend to have that child. Now, many of those unintended births end up being loved and nurtured well. But it's not an auspicious beginning for a child to be born into a family where the mother says, I really wasn't ready to have this child, or I literally did not want this child. So we have some dueling data on that issue.
Okay.
I think that's a really interesting point, and I would love to see how that interacts with where the numbers are. I would also say, though, that it's a good example of where I do think some of what we're seeing right now is a snapshot. So again, I said I was a millennial. 1993 is when I was born, and a lot of women my age are struggling with fertility. And there's more and more evidence that some of the birth control methods are actually contributing to this. And so I do wonder how much that will sort of shift. Again, I don't know what the effect would be. In terms of policies, I think that there are some sort of obvious, non-controversial things that can be done. Eliminating the marriage penalty is a very obvious one. There are tax credits that we can think about. I'm not particularly convinced that the effect of even a robust child tax credit would be more than fairly marginal. But I would say that when I mentioned my internship here at AEI a lot because it just weirdly happened to be with like some of their most prescient scholars at the time. I was mainly working for Christina Hoff Sommers for a couple of years, and policies the area I think for reform here is looking at what we do on a policy level and a cultural level as we approach educating men, as we approach men in our education system, men in the workforce, young men, adolescent men, men's struggles, disproportionate struggles with deaths of despair. These are the issues that I think are, when we talk about, I forget, was it Brad, someone said, there aren't marriageable men. And disproportionately, there's a dearth of marriageable men among lower income groups. And that's a real problem. And there are real policies in our schools that Christina wrote about all the way back in 1999 or 2001, whenever that book originally came out, that actually have clearly had an effect on this. It's things as small as recess policies that have changed dramatically for a generation, 2 generations at least now, of young men that are socializing them in ways that are not conducive to their development. And I think that's in terms of the policy areas, that's one that stands out to me.
It's a great point. Yeah, I mean, I think child tax credit and all the debate around that aside, I mean, look, let's find out in terms of how much the problem is economic. But on another one, economically, and Emily's alluding to this on the cultural level, which has the downstream economic effect, rising male wages would probably be the single most effective thing that you could do to boost the fertility rate.
Okay. We are so glad to be back live at American Enterprise Institute. I know that not all events are being done this way, but this one is. Interested in getting questions from our audience here, if you have questions for our panelists. We actually have a lot of questions coming in online, so I can turn to those, but let's take your questions to engage. Okay, so I'm going to go to the online. And let me one question I'm interested in personally, because this is selfishly, as we think about future studies for us to do in collaboration with Institute for Family Studies here. What are the follow-on questions you'd like to see asked after looking at a report like this? Ramesh?
So I actually have a specific one in mind, because I kept seeing this phrase in the report, desire to marry. And it struck me that as a social conservative who wants a strong marriage culture, the desire to marry in some sense has never been what is wanting, but that there has been a shift towards a view of marriage in which you have to achieve your life success before you embark in it, that is kind of a capstone to a successful life. And that people are not, their sense of what it takes to be ready for marriage is different than it used to be, that there's a higher bar for it. What I would like to know is to have a sense, and I'm going to leave the hard parts to the researchers, to figure out sort of some way of differentiating among people who hold these different views of what marriage is, and then finding if those views have the same kind of correlations with different demographic traits.
Okay. Other thoughts here?
I'm curious as to what it's a sort of a very obvious question, what people would at least say the barriers are. So the unmarried or the childless, and there's a way to do it where you're not just, you can say, what are the things that are preventing you from it? And one of the options can be disinterest. But what do people list? At least what do they say? Is it money? And I know there has been some research on this, but in this context, the COVID context, that's actually a fascinating question. What was it about the COVID economy and the COVID culture that may have induced some of these changes?
Okay.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Bill?
I think this cost issue is important. I know that we haven't talked very much about it, but people, especially on the left, like to point out that childcare can cost more than sending your kid to college. And how many people can afford it? And right now it's pretty hard to make it on just one income unless you're extremely well educated and working in the kind of sectors that some of us work in. And if you're not part of that Zoom group, as I think the report calls it, then it's pretty hard to get along on one income, and it's pretty hard to pay for childcare if both people are working. And so I think that's a huge barrier for a lot of people.
Let me ask this question from online. Interested in exploring the anti-fragility versus safetyist distinction a little bit more. To what extent do the panelists think the comfort of Americans to take on health risks during the pandemic also correspond with the comfort level of Americans to take on the social, economic, and time risks or costs associated with having children?
I don't see much comparison between them at all. I'll be very blunt. I just think people who are not worried about COVID and are not getting vaccinated, to be very precise about it, are being stupid.
Okay.
Just got to be blunt about it.
Ramesh, you had some thoughts.
So there's tolerance for, partly you could say some people are just less concerned about the risks of COVID, but those people also seem to be very concerned about the alleged risks of vaccines. So it's not really a question of risk aversion or risk tolerance, it's a question of what their specific views about risks are. At the general level, I think there probably is something to the idea. Tom Edsall wrote a book 20 years ago, where he was pointing out that Republicans tended to have a higher tolerance for risk in general than Democrats do, in which he thought that had something to do with their views of the welfare state. And it's not hard to see that playing out in some of our COVID debates. But at the same time, I suspect that parents of school-age children are more pro-masking kids, for example, in schools than the society at large is. That certainly anecdotally seems to be the case when, of course, I'm in an extremely blue part of Alexandria. On the other hand, I send my kids to a conservative Catholic parish school.
So thinking about the norms that Ramesh mentioned, the shifting norms as to what marriage, the barriers to entry for marriage should be and what marriage should look like, I think that's a very interesting thing to consider here, and how that in and of itself is increasingly sort of divergent on a class basis, in the same way that we see some of these other trends diverging along class lines. So I think it's a really important element of this to think about. And also, I would just raise the issue of social capital again, other types of social capital, community, civic institutions. I think people in higher income brackets, this gets to the Lena Dunham fallacy that Tim writes about, people in higher income brackets just have more social capital that makes it less intimidating, that makes it less daunting, the process of the act of entering into a marriage or having a child less daunting. And the Lena Dunham fallacy is particularly apt here, because if you watch Girls, which I think it was actually a very, very important show, a Lena Dunham show, the end of the series, the very last episode, shows that when it comes to children. I'm not going to spoil it, but it is a very important. It's just the way that Tim chose his words there was very interesting, because Lena Dunham actually got married a couple of weeks ago, by the way. So I think people with social capital, even if they are sort of more risk averse, and we have seen that among young people, and Haidt has written about that. There's been a lot of really good research on it. They also do have that social capital that makes these processes a little easier.
Yeah, I think it comes down to, it's not about the risk itself, it's risk assessment, which is that with the safetyism mindset and the risk assessment is that getting COVID is going to be the worst thing that could happen to you or your family, or to, maybe you'll consume different type of media as relative to like how much you even assess it as a risk to yourself. But then that's where values come into play, and that's probably where I would see the family formation have the ability to look at the risk of COVID and evaluate it relative to the risk of their kids not being able to go outside for like 2 years, or their kids not playing with other people, and saying, well, I'm going to look at the data for children, and we need to have masks, but also like my kids need to go back to school. Same thing in terms of socialization, and the safetyist mindset would maybe bar you from engaging in an activity which you already didn't place necessarily that much value on relative to the other person. So it actually does make complete sense now that I think about the question.
One tiny postscript, one other thing about safetyism. It does seem to me that part of the safety, the concern for safety and its effect on marriage is people are so scared of divorce. They're so scared of it not working out. Yeah. And in a way, not just social conservatives, but we social conservatives have been so successful at scaring people about divorce that they're not getting married in the first place.
I would just add, and it relates to your question earlier about where do we need more research, it's on cohabitation. I've been really struck by the data on how much your millennials, or even younger than they are cohabiting rather than getting married. And we don't know how, and many of them are having children. Some scholars call that shotgun cohabitation. You get pregnant, you have a child, and you move in with the other parent. And some of those relationships, especially amongst the better educated, they do transition into marriage. But except amongst that group, it's not clear that they will or are. And cohabitation is, I think, an attempt to avoid some risk, especially on the part of young men.
It's an option strategy.
It's a strategy for, temporizing. And so I think there's something to that, and it's worth looking at that. I'm sorry I was so unwilling to make a comparison between being safe in your behavior with COVID and being safe in your family behavior. I just don't like the analogy.
I have an addendum as well, which is that we saw correlation with religiosity here, and I think that actually comports well with the social capital idea. People who are church-going and tend to be more religious, they also tend to have tighter-knit communities.
Okay. Well, listen, we have been I really want to thank you for taking seriously the study that these organizations have put together. Your comments have been very helpful for better understanding its implications and helpful for us in thinking about where to pursue additional study going forward. Grateful to the American Enterprise Institute for their hospitality. And the report is available on the IFS website, so we encourage you to go and look at it. And let's give our panelists a warm round of applause for their contributions today. Thank you very much for joining us.